Well, if you're someone who hunts public land with high hunting pressure, you know how frustrating it can be trying to find an area by yourself, an area where you can leave the other hunters behind and target a big buck or a doe or whatever it may be in solitude. It can be really difficult to do that on some of the more heavily hunted properties. I'm up here in northern Minnesota. There's moderate hunting pressure. I know some states are worse, some states are better, but at the end of the day, it's just a really frustrating experience when you think you found that perfect spot only to have other hunters show up on your trail cams. Maybe a deer stand gets hung or something like that right next to you. So in this video, what I'm going to do is talk about the two things that I've done over the years with all my bow hunting stands where I hunt in high hunter pressure situations. The two things I've done to get away from other hunters, to leave that hunting pressure behind. And these two methods are really successful. If you can utilize these where you're at or try to replicate it where you're at, you're going to have the area to yourself, or at least you'll leave 95 to 99% of the other hunters behind. Now, both of them follow a similar principle in that I'm finding a barrier to access. So it's really just a barrier to hunter access. If you are willing, if I'm willing to cross something that another hunter is not, that's going to open up doors for you, open up deer hunting spots for you where you can be by yourself. And the first tactic I use is a wet swamp. And what a wet swamp does is it really eliminates hunters because of the fact that most guys and gals aren't willing to cross a wet swamp in the dark in the morning. If it's a swamp where you got to use knee boots and you can cross it, you could drop maybe half the hunters, maybe not quite. But if it's a wet swamp such that it requires hip boots to get across it, you're going to leave 95% of the hunters behind on the mainland. So a wet swamp could be employed in a couple of situations. These are the two that I find the most common where I'm at and that I use the most. And one is just a swamp island, a classic swamp island with a wet swamp around it. Most folks are not willing to roll on some hip boots, hike through there, through the marsh grass, the swamp grass, and get out to that swamp island. The other classic situation that I see set up quite a bit is if I'm on a chunk of public land and there's some four-wheeler trails and parking areas up here on the mainland, then it dives down into a real wet swamp and then comes back up onto high ground on the far side. You can also use it in that situation. It doesn't have to be a swamp island. It can just be any sort of wet swamp crossing where you're leaving other hunters behind on the mainland. You're crossing through that wet swamp and you're getting up onto the back side. So maybe that backside is up against private. Maybe they got some food plots over there. Maybe they've got an alfalfa field, like a nice hay field or something where there's deer. That's a classic setup. I have a couple of bow stands in that exact scenario. It's not a swamp island, it's just a wet swamp crossing that I'm getting to the back part of the public land on where nobody else is willing to go because I'm going through that wet swamp. So how I do this is I just bought a real cheap pair of hip boots, throw them over my shoulder. I start hiking in the dark on a four-wheeler trail or whatever it is. And as I make my way up to the edge of the swamp, I'll stop at the edge, throw on the hip boots, tie my shoelaces together on my hunting boots, throw them over a shoulder, walk across the swamp. Then I take the hip boots off once I get to the other side, throw my hunting boots back on, and I just leave my hip boots rolled up down in the marsh grass down by the edge of the swamp. I go hunt for the day, and then when I come out, I just repeat that process in reverse order. This has been really effective for me in leaving other hunters behind, getting into an area by myself. Can I say that it's eliminated every single other bow hunter in my area? No. Every once in a while, another guy or gal is willing to cross that swamp with me. And, as long as you're both giving each other a little bit of space, it works out in the end. And, when I bump into somebody on public land, I'm someone who wants to say hi, get to know them. Let's talk about where we're each going and work out a plan so we're not stepping on each other's toes. So that's the first thing I do to avoid hunting pressure on public land. There's a second thing that I do that some of my bow stands have this aspect to them that leaves other hunting pressure behind. Before I jump to that, I do want to remind you guys just real quickly that if you are planting trees this spring or are just trying to protect any young trees, you can check out these. They're called browse blockers. This one's sitting on a little red pine right now. And I thought this was a good example to show you guys how this tree right here with the browse blocker on it is not touched. This white spruce behind me right here, the deer do not browse those white spruce where I'm at. And there's another red pine right here. And this guy, I'll do a close-up of it, but this thing is absolutely mauled by the deer. This one did not have a browse blocker on it, just as a comparison. And so it just shows you guys the difference from this one compared to this. That browse blocker just keeps the deer off of it. If you're interested in these browse blockers, you can check out the link in the description of the video. Otherwise, just Google search browse blocker for deer and it'll take you to the website. All right, so the second thing that I do in order to leave hunting pressure behind is I use distance. And what I mean by that, that's another barrier to access for hunters. And distance is something that I think is becoming easier and easier to use every year to avoid hunting pressure. Distance meaning from the nearest parking lot, ATV trail, roadway, trailhead, foot trail, whatever it may be. Any form of access to a hunter is a location where you're going to see a lot of high hunting pressure. If you can find a spot where you've got to hike in, I'll say a half mile, at least where I'm at, a half mile hike, and I'm talking like bushwhacking through the woods, not on a four-wheeler trail or a public groomed walking trail or anything like that. If you go a half mile into the woods, you're going to leave most hunters behind, at least in my area. If you can go a mile in, that's even better. But a lot of times I've found that I don't have to go that far. A half mile bushwhacking through the woods, you're going to leave most hunters behind where you're going to have that area to yourself. I got a couple bull stands like that where I do come in for about 3/4 of a mile on a four-wheeler trail. I leave the four-wheeler trail and then it's about a half mile just cross country through the woods, through a couple swamps. But that distance factor is what allows me to have that area to myself. And if you're able-bodied, if you're willing to do that, it's really not as bad as it sounds. If you can stomach the hike, it's a really great way to leave people behind. The reason I think this is becoming a better and better tool each year is because I just don't think a lot of people want to put in that kind of effort. And you know, that's nothing wrong with that. You know, if you're someone who's not interested in that, that's not a problem, but it just creates more opportunities for people on public land who are willing to put in that kind of effort. So that's where opportunities are created for people that are willing to hike in that far. Doesn't mean you have to go a half mile in every time off a beaten path, not necessarily. It depends on the total amount of hunting pressure in your state, in your area. But for most of the part, public land gets hit really hard. And I'm just someone who, I need to be by myself. If I find a good hunting spot and I find a tree I want to hang in, I got to know that I have it to myself. If I have other people walking by, activity, grouse hunters, bow hunters, whatever it may be, other gun hunters, it's just a spot that I'm not going to hunt. I'm going to move on. I'm going to pull out of there and I'm going to keep searching until I can find a place where I can get alone, get by myself, and leave that hunting pressure behind. So those are my two tactics for leaving hunting pressure behind. They're very, very effective if you can implement that. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Think about subscribing if you'd like to do that. And until next time, I hope you guys have good luck scouting this spring.